This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.
Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson.
This
It's my
program is
pleasure to
brought
have
to
with
you-
us tonight frequent guests, Mr. Buck Melton. Welcome.
Glad to be back.
We've had conversations about many different things on many different subjects, and often the conversations center around the Constitution and the rights and privileges it grants to American citizens, and there's none more sacred, I think, than freedom of religion. So maybe we can
Quite
talk.
literally.
Well, I think we can talk about that a little bit tonight. Where exactly is that enumerated in the Constitution?
Well, it's a great misunderstanding. Everyone uses the much hackneyed phrase separation of church and state.
Yes.
Even though that phrase does not appear in the Constitution itself.
Yes.
Instead, in the federal Constitution, there are three clauses. There is the religious test clause, and I can't tell you off the top of my head exactly where that appears, but it states that public officials can't be subjected to a religious test. We can't keep atheists out of office, for instance, just because they're atheists.
And when that was
Yes.
written, I mean, there were tremendous prescriptions in England against anyone that wasn't a
yes.
member of the Anglican Church.
Yes.
You couldn't Catholics, for instance, could not go
Yes,
to
no
Harvard, could not
Catholics,
go to
no.
Cambridge or Oxford, and
Catholics, Jews, atheists were probably the big ones. Atheists presented a special problem because if you're taking an oath, which was essentially a promise to God,
Yes.
calling a curse down on yourself
Yes.
if you don't fulfill the promise.
Yes.
If you don't believe in God, the oath can't really
Yes.
ensure that you're
Yes.
telling the truth.
Yes.
So you have the religious test clause.
Yes.
And then you have the two biggies that people tend to know better, both of which appear in the First Amendment, at the very beginning of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, which is called the Establishment Clause, or
Yes.
prohibiting the free exercise thereof, which is the Free Exercise Clause.
Yes.
And so those are the two biggies, and that's what most people are really referring to unwittingly when they talk about
Yes.
separation of church and state.
Yes. Now, we have such a complex world out there. The American people are diverse. They're over 300 million. They have many different religious beliefs. And the courts have tried to guide this process in which religious freedom is freely obtainable through a maze of controversy. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, and the problem becomes that these clauses speak in absolute terms. Congress shall make no law.
Yes.
Now, if you take that literally, one of the best examples I've seen is what about the practice of thuggee, which
Yes.
involves the ritual killing of people as part of your religious exercise.
Yes.
If you really take the First Amendment at face value, then thuggee should be allowed,
Yes.
an exemption to murder statute.
Yes.
Obviously, that's not the case, so the courts have this balancing act. If there is no absolute and completely unlimited right to free exercise of religion, then what are the constraints on it? What are the limits on it? Keeping in mind it's a very important privileged right.
So this is something the courts often do they not?
Yes.
There's sort of two clashing sort of clauses or beliefs in the that are part of the American psyche enshrined in the Constitution, and a particular case comes along. It's not clear which particular right trumps the other one. Is that a fair statement?
That's correct, yes. And keep in mind with the expense involved in litigating a case all the way to the Supreme Court,
Yes.
you're going to have two sides who are not going to spend that money unless they believe they have darned good cases based
Yes.
on darn good research. So the choices that the Supreme Court has to make usually are not easy ones.
Yes. So we have in the, I guess the idea is sort of a slightly, I don't know how to say, or negative or positive thing, shall make no law. And then okay, that's fair enough. But as you indicated, sometimes the laws exist that sort of accidentally impinge on someone's concept of what their practice of religion
Yes.
would be, and that's the root of the conflict. Is that?
Yes, essentially so. That what happens if something incidentally has an effect on a core element of someone's religious belief or exercise.
Yes.
So.
Well, there are a lot of people that are Islamic people in the country. They've got their sets of beliefs. Wearing burqas, I think that's an example. Going through some kind of, I guess, check at the airport. Presumably you have to see the face, and maybe that's not permissible. Or your thoughts? I mean, how are we going to adjust to all these issues?
Well, the way that the court has tended to approach that in the last 30 years or so is based on the idea that if it isn't targeted at you specifically for religious reasons, then it might be okay. The lead case is the case of Employment Division versus Smith, which took place in Oregon. Smith was a Native American, an Indian, who claimed that he used the hallucinogenic peyote as part of his religious rituals.
Yes.
The problem was that Smith was a state employee and that he was actually working in a state-operated drug rehab clinic.
Yes.
And when it was discovered that he, in fact, was a drug rehab person who was using drugs, illegal drugs, the state of Oregon terminated him.
Yes.
He claimed this is free exercise of religion. The Supreme Court actually said, no, it's not covered. That this law against using hallucinogenics was not aimed specifically at religious use. It was a law of general application. And therefore, Smith just incidentally got caught in it, and therefore he did not have a free exercise claim in that circumstance.
Yes. Now, isn't one of the sort of root of the issue is that when our forefathers hatched out the Constitution and their conception of American rights, privileges, responsibilities, it was a very different situation. 3 million people clustered on the eastern seaboard, very few towns, people lived in the country, so the idea of practicing religion, you can't imagine a situation too much where it would impinge on someone else. But and the reach of law was pretty limited. So the actual, I guess, code that existed at that point, I mean, maybe it was just a thin sort of, shall we say, the Byron Yellow Pages, about that big. And now we've got like a New York telephone book or encyclopedia of laws. So it's much easier to have these conflicts, is it not now?
Yes, yes. One correction, that a lot of the early colonial settlement was heavily based on religious freedom and free exercise. The Pilgrims, who were separatists, the Puritans in Massachusetts, Catholics in Maryland, Anglicans in Virginia, Quakers in Pennsylvania. Yes. But they tended to keep to themselves. They were isolated from each other.
Yes.
But point well taken, that as long as you had the frontier and little government and small populations, you didn't have this friction. And now we do have all this.
Now one of the things that happened basically in our history, in our history of the Western world in a way, is the idea that if you were a citizen, then citizenhood meant that you were part of a particular religious group. So as we talked about England, or we could say Scotland as far as their viewpoints, or you could say Spain.
Yes.
Along with that, you could say if you lived in Morocco, they may have been, the Islamic world may have been slightly more generous in a way, but nevertheless, there are lots of reasons that the state wants people in the same religious group.
Yes.
And the unity often existed. I'll pick England, where the king was actually, after the Reformation, head of the church.
And to this day still is.
So he is, king or queen. And so there was an enormous consolidation and power and control that existed.
Yes.
And just to keep talking about it, it often, I guess in America, the idea was that you're going to think about issues, you want to be able to consider political issues and also your own religious beliefs, with the same kind of, I guess, idea that you are an independent person and the king can't tell you what to do. There are limits on his power and natural rights. One of the natural rights would be to come to some understanding about your personal responsibility for the welfare of your soul. That was a long dissertation. So we have this situation where we enshrined in our system, we've got these, the idea of trying to get this accomplished. And as our society's going along, there have been major, I guess, clashes or tensions that have existed, and one particular one is with the Catholic Church in a way. I mean, there have been a number of issues that have come along on this subject. Maybe you could talk about some of that.
Oh, sure. I will back up for just a second and say that that it was largely the Reformation and the religious wars and the especially things going on in England that led to the other side of the equation, the Establishment Clause, the idea that we ought to find our own way without an established church and without you being forced to contribute to a religion that you might not believe in.
Right, and that was the spirit of the times, of the Enlightenment, the last part of the 19th century. The whole idea about the restriction on human choice, the state or some kind of external apparatus was locking you up, and a lot of the importance of the word freedom, whatever that means, which is a very the sine qua non of life in America, at least the perception that you're going to be free.
It's
that
also
comes
a weasel
from
word. And also another interesting point.
It's a big word. We could talk we could talk for hours about what that word does. Yes.
Also, the idea that yes, we have disestablished churches in this country. The last established church, I think, disappeared in the 1830s at the state level. But we have instead established, if you will, the American civil religion, the religion of the people, the religion of the Constitution, the religion that inculcates civic responsibility. And that is what we have replaced traditional established religions with.
Well, you could, I don't want to get too profound about the subject, but you could really sail that into secularism. You know, the idea that you're a secular world. And just to go back to the Enlightenment and some of the things that happened about religion, here we sort of wanted to make everything pretty free. And the excesses of the French Revolution, it actually became a totally sort of nihilistic kind of arrangement. And you could say the Soviet Union, the same thing went that way. So totally unencumbered man to make free choices. Religion is gone, but sort of something else replaces it. Yes. And it may be some kind of neo-paganism in a way, consumption for its own pleasures.
Well, it's a new God that we call the people. And if you look at this this abstract concept that we call the people and what can be done in the name of the people in the United States and also in extreme circumstances like the French Revolution, this people, whatever it is, it's hard to pin down. It's hard to. It doesn't have any concrete nature that you can see and touch, and the people do have the aspects of godhood.
Well, do they or their benefactors? In other words, it's like an Animal House thing. They're controlling apparatus. So you could pick the communist world back in the Joe Stalin era.
Yes.
The People's Republic. So all the People's Democratic Republic of Poland. The People's Democratic Republic of Hungary. And the idea is that the will of the people was expressed through through an alleged democratic process, that there was going to be some kind of central quasi-dictator, and dare I use the word protector, that was going to actually represent and express the people's will. So the people had, through some kind of often flawed process, faux democracy, chosen this kind of person.
Yes.
And then he had absolute power and no restraint on his exercising his personal will.
Yes. So,
which allegedly was the people's will.
So yes, the people speak through their high priest.
Yes.
And the high priest really knows the will of the people, and to disobey means death and
yes.
Sort of thing.
So well, I mean, okay, so keep going. You're on this. You're on a roll here. Let's hear this.
Well, that brings us to, I think, where you were headed with the situation of the Catholic Church, and not just the Catholic Church, but also certain conservative evangelicals in light of the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare.
And that's something on the lips of everyone these days. We're just about to embark on this great experiment, and we'll see what happens. Yes.
Yes. The Catholic Church tends to get singled out for a couple of reasons. First of all, it is the biggest in terms of membership religious organization in the United States, with I think the Southern Baptists, actually lapsed Catholics running second, and Southern Baptist running third.
What about lapsed Southern Baptists? Are they in there? Is that a large number?
I don't know where they come into it.
Okay,
So.
all right. We'll leave them alone tonight.
But yes, so it's the biggest, it's also the most centralized, if you will, as opposed to a congregational arrangement. And their doctrines on, for instance, abortion and birth control
Yes.
are the most they've been the most thoroughly formulated, they're the most
Yes.
long-standing. And so they tend to get most of the attention,
Yes.
even though a huge number of Catholics, I would call so-called Catholics, because they are no longer adhering to church doctrine on
Yes.
matters like birth control and abortion.
Yes.
The most famous example, though, recently is the Hobby Lobby case. The owner of the entire Hobby Lobby Corporation, whose name escapes me, he is not Catholic. He is a conservative evangelical
Yes.
Christian. But he argued that certain types of birth control are abortifacient.
Yes.
That one of the ways the pill works is
Right.
to mess with the uterine lining and
Right.
therefore prevent implantation of a fertilized egg. Life has begun at conception.
Yes, yes.
Therefore, he could not, in good conscience, pay for an insurance plan for his employees that would include abortifacient
Yes,
methods.
right.
Therefore, he was having to pay the penalty, which is a tax, which is not a penalty, which is not a tax,
Right.
as Chief Justice Roberts told us, of, I think, $1 million per day.
Wow. That's a pretty stiff number. I mean,
Yes.
how was that hatched out? Such a great number?
I forget, but it was in
was
the
a big
millions.
number.
Yes,
Yeah,
it was
yeah,
a
it's
big number. It was a
yeah.
million plus for every day that he didn't get insurance. He tried to get an injunction against the application of the act. It went all the way up to the wise Latina woman, Sonia Sotomayor, acting as a circuit judge in that case, and she refused the stay. But he has won on the merits at the district level. I'm not sure if it's gone to the circuit court yet. So right now in his circuit, and I don't know which circuit that is, they have said that we've got a free exercise problem and that he does not have to pay this money.
Now,
So-
as this litigation winds its way through the courts, that's a rather important sort of issue we're discussing tonight. I believe it bears some attention. So we have the government is becoming so powerful and so invasive as it attempts to protect people and give people certain privileges and rights that it really is disturbing a lot of religious principles as
Yes.
it expands. And so the arbitrators of this issue presumably are the courts. And you made sort of a passing comment about a wise Latino
Yes.
person. Maybe this is one of the things that's dividing the country a lot, is that you could not have a neutral person in the judicial system that was a particular ethnicity or race or religious. A normal rational person would be unacceptable. You'd have to have a particular ethnic or religious person there to find justice.
Yes, and there's also the danger of activism, and you hear it nowadays, usually uttered by Rush Limbaugh types, those liberal activists. Activism can be conservative as well as liberal. The conservative activists of the Supreme Court were the big news in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that
Yes.
they would impose their own political philosophies and ideologies through their judging.
Yes, yes.
So activism is not partisan. It can be liberal, it can be
Right,
conservative.
right.
Today it tends to be liberal, although not always.
Yes.
In past ages it has tended to be conservative.
Yes.
But reading one's own idea into the law, or saying, what outcome do I want?
Yes.
Let me look up the law to support that.
So the
Yes.
balancing act, the courts, the responsibilities they have here are pretty formidable. The government is expanding out into all quadrants of American life. It's running against diverse religious beliefs everywhere. How do you fashion out some kind of appropriate response? Now, the particular case you quoted, may I ask this question?
Yes.
If someone says, the government says, well, you have to pay us $1 million a day because of your religious beliefs, and now isn't that just mount up and you win the appeal, but if you finally lose, will you be destroyed because the number is mounted up with interest being paid, and so finally, you lose at the Supreme Court. Now you have to pay us $400 million with interest.
Yes, probably so, and that's a danger. And another danger is that that people who want the secular civic religion, which
Yes.
of course includes right to contraception, right to abortion,
Yes.
to trump a sectarian religion, if you will, like to speak in terms not of free exercise of religion, but freedom of worship. So the critique of Hobby Lobby would be, well, you have to pay us this money because you objecting to birth control pills has nothing to do with your freedom of worship. You just go into your church and you worship there, but when you come out, you're subject to civil religion. The First Amendment does not speak of freedom of worship. It speaks of free exercise of religion.
Yes. So that's a real, there must be like thousands of, the case law on this must be extraordinary. I mean, there must be lawyers that do nothing except pound their way through these issues.
It is one of the more heavily litigated aspects of the First Amendment. It certainly is. So.
Now, some other issues out there that I think, I mean, we can maybe just talk about the Catholic Church a bit, since it's, as you mentioned, it has sort of a high profile on these issues. What other, I guess, run-ins have they had with government, I guess the government in general? I mean, presumably one of the things that's happened is with abortion and lots of issues on that, and which hospitals, is there some issues about hospitals that are being forced to, I don't know, practice abortion or come close to it, or what about that?
Yes,
if the law
yes.
said, does the law say, the Affordable Care Act, does it say that this is something that needs to happen? And presumably the Supreme Court has said this is it's a human right. The right to have an abortion is a big human right, and if you don't allow people to have it, you're in violation of the law. You have any thoughts?
Yes. The term that you would normally hear from a common law standpoint would be fundamental right, although I'm sure somebody has extended that to sort of a natural law, human right idea as well.
Yes.
A few years ago in Connecticut, and this shows the danger of taking federal money, Connecticut passed a law that said if you take any sort of state funds, then you have to do X, Y, and Z, and one of these is to be able to
Right.
provide the morning after pill.
Right.
And the Catholic bishops in Connecticut said this is unconscionable, we can't do that, we won't do that, we're going to fight that. And then when the law was passed, they said, well, we have to do it, it's the law, which is actually the bishops rolling over.
Yes.
For instance, I'll give you an even more blatant example. In the wake of the sex abuse scandal of 10 or 12 years ago, which the church still has not responsibly solved, but when it was at its worst 10 to 12 years ago, I think it was someone in Kentucky who wanted to pass a law of evidence that required anyone, any cleric, and this is obviously aimed at Catholic priests, who heard anything in confession that would point the finger at a sex abuse perpetrator,
yes.
Would be legally bound to
Right.
report that.
Right.
Well, under Catholic canon law and under
Right.
Catholic theology, every priest
Right.
would be legally bound to go to jail rather than break the seal of the
Yes,
confession.
sure.
That's just something they have to do. But unfortunately, current church leadership, that did not pass.
Right.
But I very much fear that current church leadership is more likely these days to say, well, it's the law, what can we do?
Yes.
Which is really sort of betraying where they need to be with the Catholic faith.
Well, now, going back a little bit, we discussed the situation in England and in general the idea of just the way humans are, or governments are, the idea of some kind of centralized control the government
Yes.
has. They like to have sort of a religious patina attached to it, so they can
Yes.
totally control everything. And that many times the politicians and government bureaucrats, I'm not slighting them, but I'm just making a comment, having this control is a big deal. If we have some kind of new religion in the country, some kind of secularism, dare I say, neo-paganism, or those viewpoints out there, whatever that is, and it comports with the government. I mean, in some ways, the two act as a controlling mechanism on our Americans.
Yes.
And that one of the important things of religion is checks and balances against the government.
Yes.
Isn't that our whole deal here? So the religion has to be able to check this extraordinary power the government is attempting to exercise more than ever.
Well, it may be one of the few things left that can check the government. I mean, obviously in the American system, we have tried to include built-in checks on the government, the two biggest ones being separation of powers and
Yes.
federalism. Federalism in some of the most important ways is now a dead letter, and in other ways it's very weak. Once the federal government dangles money in front of the state and says you can have it if you do our bidding, that's a major problem. The fight between church and state, between the religious authority and the secular authority, goes back at least 1,000 years, and probably a good bit earlier, when Christ says, "Render to Caesar that which is Caesar's." He's setting the dynamic.
Is he begging the question? What does Caesar actually need, or what does he get? Is that he sort of begs the question a bit, doesn't he?
Yes, it's a perennial problem. It's one that can't be easily solved. On the one hand, we'll go back even before Christ and get to Aristotle. We are political animals and we're social animals, that we have to live in communities, and that means that rights have to be limited if we're not all going to kill each other. The problem is that religion is not just a vertical thing. It's not just me and my God or gods. I will almost always have to act in some sort of moral or ethical fashion towards other members of the community based on what my gods tell me I have to do. And that leads into a conflict with secular authority. If secular authority decrees, no, your ethics don't fit into the community. There's really no easy solution for that.
And finally, and then we'll save this for another time, there's an increasing conflict if people follow, I don't know how I could phrase this, but different, not Christians or Islamic people or Buddhists or Hindus, whatever their religious arrangements are, since you could say the country is not what you'd call a Christian country any longer, it's really quite complicated. Well, I think we are going to have to pursue this some more. We'll talk again about this. It's been great having you here, and I'm sure our conversation tonight over the airways aroused some interest.
Glad to be
here. Thank you so much. Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions, treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to